Okay. Good morning. Our learning is Lila Nishmas Mindel, Mariam Bas Kalman Reuven, her Neshama Shem Aliyah. We have just started the 8th perek of Masechah Shabbos, and we are, where are we? We're at Amar Rava, which is the last line on Ayin Vav Amud Beis. It's like the last line on 76b, okay? It's the last line on Ayin Vav on Beis, the last line on 76b. So what we saw in the Mishnah spoke about what measurements, what amounts a person is chayav for carrying out on Shabbos. Again, we said you can't carry like a granule of salt. That would not be enough typically. You need to carry something of substance. And so the Mishnah said, when it comes to wine, it's kedei mezigas hakos. It's the amount needed to mix and make a single cup of wine, okay? And then we had Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Baravua coming along and saying that the amount of wine needed to mix a cup is 1/4 of a revius, and the amount we need for a kosher bracha is a revius. Okay, that's what we came out with. As we'll see, that's not so clear. Not everyone's going to agree that you need a revius for a cup of bracha. Okay, meaning a cup for kiddush and a cup for benching. Not everyone agrees you need a revius. But first, we're going to bring another opinion who does say that it does need to be a revius, and he's also going to try to prove it from our Mishnah. So Amar Rava. Rava says, Af anan namitanin. I also learned, and now we're on top of Ayin Zayin, Amud Aleph 77a. I also learned this from our Mishnah, from the Mishnah itself. In other words, this that you need a revius of wine. This that you need a revius of wine for a kosher bracha, I could learn from the Mishnah itself. Why? Because our Mishnah said, "Hamotzi yain kidei mezigas kos." The Mishnah says you need enough wine in order to mix and make a single cup. But it doesn't say how much a cup is, right? V'tani Allah, and we learned in a brisa kidei mezigas kos yafe. So the brisa teaches us that the amount of a cup is enough for a cup of benching, meaning a kos of bracha, meaning a cup of benching, a cup of kiddush. Okay, so far we still don't have the measurement. It doesn't tell us the amount, but it just tells us that it's going to be enough to make a nice cup, a cup for bracha. Okay, so all we know from our Mishnah and the brisa, from the Tanaic literature, is that you're going to have enough to mix and make a cup of bracha. Viktani Seifa, and the last part of our Mishnah says, Ushar kol hamashkin b'revius, that all other liquids add up, that all other liquids, when it comes to taking out, orange juice, then it needs to be a revius. So Rava infers as follows. Rava says, now, our Mishnah doesn't tell us the amount, it doesn't tell us the measurements, but it says enough to make a nice cup. And we know that it doesn't tell us what that amount is, but the rest of the Mishnah, later on in the Mishnah, it says that the amount of liquid for all other things is a revius. So we can infer from there that when it says a cup, it's referring to a revius. Okay, so therefore Rava says we could infer, even though the Mishnah doesn't say explicitly, we could infer from here that when the Mishnah speaks about wine, it says enough to mix a cup, okay, which is obviously not the full amount, it's the amount of wine plus X amount of water that makes up the full cup. What's the full cup? The full cup is revius, just like you see at the end of a Mishnah that when it comes to all other liquids, it's revius. Right? You see his logic, right? His logic is basically, even though our Mishnah doesn't tell us how much the cup is, how much we need to mix in to make a cup, presumably it's revius just like all other liquids. That's his assumption.
Well, the wording is very awkward, though.
What do you mean?
It doesn't mention it doesn't mention that it kind of separates the beginning and the ratio and the zeva, saying our kol hamashkin b'revius.
Correct, because
it would seem to exclude those.
Well, correct. So wine is definitely different because with wine, it's not a revius of wine, but it's enough to make a revius of wine. Right? In other words, wine, without a doubt, meaning orange juice, apple juice, and pineapple juice are different than wine because they actually need a revius. That it says explicitly. You need a revius of those liquids in order to be chayav. When it comes to wine, you need something less. It says enough to make a nice cup. But the question is, what does nice cup equal? It doesn't say the Mishnah. So he says, well, we can see from the last part of the Mishnah, revius is the magic number, okay? So presumably, when it's talking about making a nice cup, the nice cup is revius. Although, again, but to your point, Max, wine is clearly different in the sense that you don't need to actually take out a revius. You take out enough to make a revius, which is clearly a portion of a revius. Okay, fine. So v'Rava l'tamei. Now this only makes sense if Rava is consistent with his approach, which he says elsewhere. Amarava kol chamra d'lodari al chad tlas maya lav chamrahu. That any wine that doesn't have 3 parts of water for each part of wine, meaning the way to make wine is to have 3/4 water, 1 part wine, lav chamrahu. If it doesn't have that proportion, it's not good wine, okay? So it needs to have a proportions of 1/4 wine, 1/4 like undiluted wine, and 3/4 water in order for it to be wine, okay? So that is the premise of Rava's point, and therefore Rava says, hey, we could see the same thing from our Mishnah itself, because the Mishnah says liquids need to have a revius, and so therefore we can infer from there that the cup cup of bracha, the cup that we use for kiddush and the cup we use for benching, is also going to be a revius. And how do you make a revius? Well, I know from elsewhere that it's 1/4 wine, 3/4 water. Okay, now Abaye doesn't like this. Amar Abaye, shtei tshuvas b'davar. I have two issues with your inference. Chada, Ditznan. First of all, we learned somewhere else in Maseches Nida that v'hamazug, the color of diluted wine, is shnei chelkei mayim v'echad yayin min yayin hashironi. 2 parts water and 1 part wine. Okay, so what's going on here? Maseches Nida talks about the different colors. Okay, different colors that would be considered dam nida. Okay, there are different shades of red, and one of the shades of red, how would you teach? Right, this is such an interesting thing. How do you teach someone different shades of red in a book, in a textual book, which doesn't have color? It's not a coloring book. How do you teach colors? So you use different items that are well known in order to teach colors. So what's the way you teach colors? So you basically says this type of wine. What's this type of wine? Yain hashironi. And what's the ratio? The ratio is 1 part wine, 2 parts water. Right? So first of all, clearly, your whole premise, Rava, is that you believe that wine is made 1/4 wine, 3/4 water. We see from an explicit Mishnah which says that in order to make this type of wine, it's 1 part wine, 2 parts water. Not like you're saying. That's number one. The ode, but a more basic question, Mayim bekadu mitzdarfin. How does it make sense to say, you, Rava, want to say that the reason that you are going to be chayiv on Shabbos for carrying out the wine is because it can mix together with water and make a good cup? He says, that can't be the idea because the water's not there. He says this whole idea, meaning the reason that why, Rabbi says like this, the Mishnah had 2 categories. It had things like apple juice, orange juice, and it said, for there you have revius. Then it had things like honey, right? How much honey did you need? Do you remember how much honey? What was it? It was enough to, I think it was oil. Oil was a small, honey was to cover some blemish, and oil was to cover a finger, right? The point is that those other substances, they were intrinsically valuable, right? They're intrinsically valuable. It wasn't because of what they're going to ultimately be mixed with. So Abaye says, don't tell me that the reason that the amounts of minuscule wine, the little bit of wine is important because of water that it's going to be mixed with. That doesn't make sense. The water's not there. Why would it be chashav right now? It's not there yet. Has to be the wine is important regardless of the amount of water that it's going to be mixed with. And it's not about making a cup elsewhere, that elsewhere later I'm going to mix it with a cup. That's not how it works. All the other examples of small measurements are because there's an intrinsic value of that thing. And therefore, maybe it has nothing to do with the water that it's ultimately going to be mixed with. It doesn't make sense for it to be the water that it mixed with because the water is in the barrel. Meaning, back in the day, they didn't have water in a tap. They had water in a barrel. It's not valuable because of what you're ultimately going to mix it with. It's valuable because a small measurement of wine is valuable, and therefore you can't make any of these inferences about how much wine to make for a cup of kiddush, etc. It has nothing to do with it. The wine must be valuable, be similar to honey and oil because of its intrinsic value, not because of what it's going to ultimately be mixed with. So Amalei Rava defends his position. He says no. He says that which you want to bring me a proof from the Mishnah in Nido, which said that to make wine of that when we talk about this wine that presents this color at Maseches Nida, and it says 2 parts water, 1 part wine, he says yain hashironi lechud. It says explicitly over there we're talking about yain hashironi. Yain hashironi is a unique type of wine. Derafe, it's a weak type of wine, right? In other words, we have many types of wines. There's like if you want to mix a cab, so it's going to be cab is going to be a heavier type of wine. If you want to make a Pinot Noir or whatever it is, it's a lighter wine, and therefore you're going to have less water mixed into it. Right? In other words, he says, how could you bring me a proof that says, oh no, you're wrong, wines aren't made 3/4 water, 1/4 wine, because of this example of yain hashironi. Yain hashironi is a weak wine, and there you need less water to make the wine, because if you have too much water, it's going to overwhelm the wine. But I'm talking about, generally speaking, wine is 1/4 wine, 3/4 water, except for yain hashironi, which is a very weak wine. There you wouldn't want to mix too much water in. Inam, he says a different answer. Okay, he says has mishum chazusa. He says over there we're not even talking about drinking. What are we talking about? We're talking about defining a color palette, right? And so maybe it's not about when the Mishnah said over there 2 parts water, 1 part wine. It wasn't talking about and then drink it because it's good wine. We're not talking about drinking. We're talking about making colors. So basically, we said if you want to know the color that the Mishnah is referring to, take 1 part wine, 2 parts water, and you'll have that color. No one says it's a good drink. That's not the right drink. There we're talking about, we're trying to show you what the colors are. Mishum chazusa. Avalataima, but to achieve the proper taste, baitzvei, you would have to have 3/4 to 1/4. Right? So, right, he's saying, in other words, the Mishnah in Nida, that's not a question. A, because maybe it's Yaina Shironi, which is the exception. B, maybe it's about there it's just about the appearance, the color, and nothing to do with taste. And then in terms of your question, to Amaz Mayim Bekan Starfin, your question was, how, at the end of the day, if the water's in the barrel, how could it combine? Linian Shabbos He says, yeah, it does combine. It's true, you're not carrying out water. But on Shabbos, what's the criteria for carrying? The criteria for carrying is if it's something that's important. So if this amount of wine is important because of water that it will ultimately mix with, then it's important. For example, again, the idea is that anything that's important, by definition, you're going to be high for carrying. So let's say I carry something which doesn't have, I carry a flashlight without its batteries, right? So you say, are you chayav? The answer would be yes. Grant doesn't have batteries now, but it's important. A flashlight is important. So grant that's missing part of what it needs in order to function. But everyone would say this is an chashav thing, and therefore your question of it's in its barrel, how does it connect together? Yeah, it's not a matter of spiritually speaking, connecting. The point is that since this is enough, that if it had the proper other ingredients, i.e. that amount of water, it would mix. It's important, therefore it is important, and you would be chayiv. Okay, and Rava rests his case. Okay, now we go on to a different discussion about congealed wine. Okay, so the question is going to be, if you have, we spoke about so far, Rava rests his case that the amount of wine we need is 1/4 of a revius of wine. That's how much you need. But what about if the wine is congealed? At that point, how much wine would you need? Okay, so Tana Yavish B'Kazai. So a person carries out congealed wine, then you would carry out the amount that is the size of an olive. Okay, Divrei Rav Nassan. These are the words of Rav Nassan. Now, what is the assumption of an olive? What's the relationship between an olive and olive size, a Kazai size, and wine? The assumption is that Rav Nassan is saying that an olive, if you allow a revius of wine to congeal, it would measure an olive. Okay, a revius of liquid and a kazayas of solid is the same thing. Yeah? Okay.
We don't go with the dried fig because it's an edible type of thing. You don't eat it itself in its form.
What do you mean?
We've been saying until now that the dried fig is the
very good. Right, very good. Okay, good. So Max is pointing out that the reason we don't use the general measurement, which we've been saying, which is a fig, is because over here it's not something which is eaten as a solid. It has to be something which is theoretically able to be eaten as a liquid, which is a revius, and that's going to be and for liquids it's a revius, and so the equivalent of a liquid revius is going to be a kazayas, not a fig. Excellent. Okay. Okay. Now we've seen this. What we're about to do is something we've seen before, and that is that sometimes, again, keep in mind, the Gemaras were taught, these ideas were taught to people orally. They didn't have an article Gemara sitting in front of them, they didn't have a Gemara, and they had to memorize these things. So sometimes what they would do is what to us would seem like a tangent is actually quite helpful for them because it helps them remember different principles. So we're going to see this idea of a liquid revius equaling a kazayas of solids. We're going to say, this principle is taught elsewhere. This principle is taught in another place, nothing to do with Shabbos, but this idea of liquid revius equaling a kazayas of solid is going to be found somewhere else, and that's where Rav Yosef is going to come along and tell us. Rav Yosef, Rav Nassan, who we just quoted, Rav Yosef, Rav Yehuda, Amru Davar Echad. And Rav Yosef, Rav Yehuda, they actually said the same thing. Okay, what is that? Rav Nassan Hada Amran. Rav Nassan, this view which we just said about the congealed wine being a kazayas, that's the amount which is equivalent to a revius of liquid wine. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, and which we're teaching of Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, the following. The time we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shisha Dvar Mikula Beis Shammai U'Mechumer Beis Hillel. Okay, normally we say Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. Who's the lenient one? Beis Hillel. But there's 6 exceptions. There's 6 exceptions, 6 places where Beis Shammai is more lenient than Beis Hillel. One of those is Dam Nevela, regarding the blood of a Nevela. Nevela is a carcass. Nevela is an animal that was not slaughtered, and the halacha is that an animal is not slaughtered, it's mitame. It causes someone to become impure. Okay? That's true for the flesh of the animal. Okay? So if someone comes into contact with the flesh of an unslaughtered animal, they would be tame. Okay? What about the blood of a Nevela? Is the blood going to be metame? Is it going to cause impurity or not? Beis Shammai metaharin. Beis Shammai says it does not. It says if you come into contact with the blood of a carcass of a nevela, you are not tame. Ubeis Hillel metamin. Beis Hillel here is more stringent. He says it does cause someone to come tame. Amar Rav Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. And Rav Yosef Rabbi Yehuda comes along and qualifies what Beis Hillel said in terms of becoming tamei. He says, "Af kishatimu Beis Hillel." When Beis Hillel said that blood of a carcass of a nevela causes someone to become tamei, lo timu ela b'dam sheyesh bo revius. It's only when the blood has a revius size of a measurement of blood. Why? Because the amount of blood or a revius of blood is able to congeal and become an olive-sized piece. Why is that significant? Because when it comes to tuma, of flesh, it has to be a kezias of flesh. So he comes along and says, when we're talking about blood, it has to be a revius size of blood, because a revius size of blood is the equivalent to a kezias of flesh. Make sense? Right? Because again, let's just go back for a second. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree that if a person comes into contact with the flesh of an avela, then you become tameh. Blood, is blood flesh? Maybe yes, maybe no. Beis Hillel says it's flesh, but only when it's going to be the measurement of a kezias of flesh. So what is that? That's revius. So you see, it seems like he's saying, right, that would seem to tell us that they're both saying the same principle. We just saw the wine revius is going to be said, Rav Nassan said that a wine revius is going to be equivalent to a kezias of congealed revius, right? Which would seem to be the exact same thing over here about the blood revius being the size of a kezias of flesh, right? So they seem to be saying the same thing. However, Abaye points out that they're not actually identical. They look similar, they sound similar, but they're not actually identical. Amar Abaye says, Damalohi, maybe that's not the same thing. Ad kan, we're on 77a3, or Ayin Amud Aleph on the bottom. Damalohi, Ad kan lo kamar Rav Nassan hachadavar revius, el biyayin deklish. Aval badam desmich kezias lo bar revius. Maybe Rav Nassan only said his halacha when it comes to wine, which is a thin liquid, okay? And if it's a thin liquid, it loses a lot of its volume when it congeals, okay? But when it comes to blood, which is thick, kizayis lo by revius, maybe an olive-sized piece, one would not require a revius of blood. In other words, is wine and blood the same thing? Let's say you have something which is thick. I'm sorry if this is a little too gory for people in the morning, right? But blood is thick, right? So maybe you need less blood to create a kizayis of flesh, right? And therefore, although Rav Nassan said, "Oh yeah, a revius of wine is equivalent to a kezias of congealed wine," maybe that's only for wine. When it comes to blood, maybe he'd say, "I need less blood." And the flip side, inami ad kan lakom Rav Yosef Rav Yehuda hasam de chazayis sagale revius el badam desmich. Maybe Rav Yosef Rav Yehuda was talking about nevela, was only saying something by blood because it's thick. Aval yayin deklish, when it comes to wine which is thin, kazayis have a yosef revius, maybe a kazayis is going to be more than a revius, v'chimapik pachos b'kazayis l'chayv, and therefore if a person goes out, according to Rav Yosef Rav Yehuda, who was talking about blood, maybe he would hold when it comes to wine, even less wine would be enough to make a kazayis of solid. Okay, so the bottom line is, they sound similar, but they're not actually identical. Fine. Okay, now we have a very interesting discussion about ayins and aleph. You'll see what I mean. Okay, so the Mishnah said, chalav kedei gemia. If a person takes out milk, it's enough for a person to swallow the milk, right? How much milk? Enough to swallow. Another, like a mouthful of milk. Ask the Gemara, Bailahu. So when this was mentioned, they asked, kedei gemia or kedei gemia? Okay, is it with an aleph gemia? Is gemia spelled with an aleph, or is gemia spelled with an ayin? Okay, Amrav Nachman Yitzchak Hagmi'inina ma'at ma'im mikadech. He quotes from Eliezer speaking to Rivka, who says Hagmi'ini, and there it's with an aleph. Okay, let's keep on reading. Then we'll explain this. Ibailahu. Another question about another spelling of aleph and ayin. We're on the ayin zayin amabez. Garinin o garinin. In the Mishnah before, we spoke about the fact that when we measure the amount of fruit a person carries, pits are not included. When the word pit, is it spelled with an aleph or an ayin? Rava bar Ula v'nigra me'er kecha. Okay, so the pasuk in Vayikra speaks about a deduction from valuation, and there it's with an ayin. What does deduction have to do with a pit? A pit deducts from the space of the fruit. So pit is like seen as a deduction of the fruit itself. So we assume that pit and deduction are actually the same word, and you see it's spelled with an ayin. Okay, Yibailahu. Omamos or omamos. So we had a Mishnah earlier which spoke about coals, and it spoke about them still glowing. Is it spelled with an aleph or an ayin? Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, arazim lo amamuhu began elokim. Cedars will not dim splendor in the garden of Hashem. So you see it's spelled with an ayin. Yibailahu ma'amtzin tnan o ma'amtzin. We're going to see a Mishnah later on about closing the eyes of someone who is passing away. Is it spelled with an aleph or an ayin? Amar Rav Chia bar Abba, Amar Rav Yochanan ve'otzem ena me'oz bara. So it's spelled with an ayin. A person covers their eyes from seeing evil, averts their eyes from seeing evil, and you see it spelled with an ayin. Okay, now what's going on over here? Who cares? Who cares is that halachically, there's a Mishnah that says that a person who doesn't, when they speak, when a person who cannot distinguish between the letter ayin and the letter aleph is not allowed to duchen or lead davening. Now you say, what are you talking about? Ayin and aleph make the exact same sounds. That's because we probably have a corrupt version of Hebrew, and that's wrong. Ayin and Aleph actually do make a different sound. If you go to Teimani, they make like a guttural sound for the ayin, like ayin or something like that, and it has a bit of a different sound. There are different variations of it, but the truth is ayin and Aleph have some very significant different sound, and therefore this question is not just a theoretical question of like, oh, we're copying down the Mishnah, we want to know how to spell it. We want to know how to pronounce these words, and therefore they're using these psukim to back it up, to quote it, because ayin and Aleph actually have different sounds. There's, generally speaking, there's like three different traditions when it comes to speaking. There's like the Sephardi, there's the Ashkenazi, there's Teimani, and those are like the Yemenite. Those are like three general categories of how to speak. Even within them, they have variations. Even the Teimanim, we're not even sure if that's exactly how they spoke originally. People say Teimani is most accurate. It's not entirely true, meaning the same way that if you go back to like England, I don't know, 1,000 years ago, and like look at an English statement, you probably would not know what they were talking about. And not because of the English accents, because the language evolves. All languages evolve by definition based on, a lot of factors. And so there's been a lot of changes, but this question, again, is not just a theoretical question. It's a very relevant question. Aleph and Ayin do sound quite, to us, sound identical. There's absolutely no difference. I saw someone wrote that they asked Rav Soloveitchik, they were Ashkenaz, but they were taught when they were taught the difference in Aleph and Ayin, he was leaning in the shoulder. Rav Soloveitchik said, you should do them. He said, we Ashkenaz, we don't know how to make the difference, do it very well, and therefore we shouldn't do it. There's nothing for us to do. We're stuck. Okay, we just go with the Aleph and Ayin. But you who do know those differences, you should do it. The flip side is, for Sephardim, they're tough and saf. They sound exactly the same. Again, Teimanim will have like a th sound for one and a t sound for the other. That the letters are not identical, right? So there's confusion around. No one has a perfect Masorah. No one could say definitively, like, we don't have any recordings or YouTube videos or whatever it is from like back in the days. We don't really have like a perfect idea of which is which, but that's the premise of this question. Okay, so let's learn a little bit of Michtam Layok. It's been a while. If you recall, we've been speaking about this idea of ahava, of love. That's been the piece. So he has this piece over here. I'll just mention very briefly, and that is that he points out, although if you recall, he spoke about the fact that there are people who at the core are givers and people at the core are takers. Remember that? Right? He says that really, if we could think about ourselves as either givers or takers, and think about every action we do. Are we trying to give, or is it about us in this? Is it about the other person in this scenario, or is it about ourselves? What are we trying to do in this scenario? But he says that at the core, he says every person does have some capacity to give, and he says we make the following mistake. He says when it comes to giving and loving someone, he says there's a deep relationship between them, and we usually mix up what is the cause and what is the effect. We normally think that we give to those that we love, but he says, and there's a very famous Rav Dessler idea, and that is that the root of the word ahava is what? The root of the word ahava is hav. The word hav means to give. He says it's not that we give to those that we love; it's that we love those that we give to. Right? There's a famous discussion in the Gemara that says that if there's someone that's an enemy of yours and someone who's a friend of yours and they both need help, you're supposed to help your enemy. Why? Because by helping them, it's actually going to change. It's going to transform your relationship with them. And by giving to someone that actually helps us, ends up causing us to love. And there's actually been a lot of studies that have recently shown this thing, that when we give to people, it actually changes the way we think about them. Cognitive dissonance plays a role in this, but the point is that our actions actually transform the way that we think. So he says, sometimes we think that I'm giving to the people that I love. I'm helping the people that I love. There's people that I don't love. It's harder for me to give to them. He says you're making a mistake. He says give to those people. Start giving to strangers. Start giving to those outside of your immediate circle. And in doing so, you're actually going to transform your relationship with them. Instead of thinking to ourselves, it's hard for me to give that person. I don't like that person. No, the reason you don't like them is because you haven't been giving to them. If you want to become more of a giving person, more of a loving person, stop thinking about the emotions, focus more on the actions. And in doing so, we're going to transform our feeling towards them. And this is part of his discussion about the steps that we need to take in order to become more loving people, which we'll go into further. Have a great day.